Next up, Neil Selwyn, Monash University. Please, Neil.
Thank you very much. I'm an old man, so I'm going to stand behind the lectern. I'm also going to lean into the conference theme as well. I think this is a really brave conference theme. You don't normally get this kind of conference theme at an EdTech conference. It's kind of implying that EdTech is not perfect. It's kind of implying that we could do better. And I think this is definitely something we need to face up to. We need to think about these words like responsibility, empathy, duty of care, human. And I think because the past 10 years have shown us that we've reached a point, I think, of mass digitalization, and there's a mounting dissatisfaction with what we've got. It's now becoming common to hear some really damning words associated with technology and indeed education technology. As usual, there's a very great German word for this. Basically, the idea that things that we think are solutions to problems are actually probably making things worse, not better. Another great word is Cory Doctorow's enshittification, which is sort of the word of 2025. And we can see this, the steady degradation of key online platforms and services. And you hear people routinely now talking about social harms of technology, even social wrongs of technology. Technology is described as extractive, exploitative, authoritarian, and an environmental disaster. And this disillusionment with technology in 2025 is not just a fringe, progressive, lefty concern. We are seeing, I think, a middle-aged, middle-class, mainstream techlash now, a reactionary turn away from all things tech. So I think, as an EdTech community, we need to face up to the fact that we're now actually seen as one of the bad guys, rather than being on the side of good. The question is, what do we do? And I think the OEB conference this year is halfway there with the theme. We definitely need to think about values like humanity and care and respect and empathy. But this needs to be done with real conviction and real care, because thinking about values and acting on values is not easy. So my key questions I wanted to go through today is, how can we make EdTech better? How can we have genuinely value-driven EdTech? And what values do we want to see in the work that we do? So in the next 10 minutes, I just wanted to make a few points. I think at the moment, when we talk about things like AI, it's very much vibe-based, not value-based, and we need to move from vibes to values. But it's really difficult. We need to collectively engage with values that we want to be seen driving our work, but the EdTech community is not very good with dealing with values. But I think we can do it, but it's going to be hard work. So there's a lot of work to do, but I think this is the place to do it. So my first point, most tech conversations I think about EdTech have been run on vibes. The most obvious one is AI. Generative AI comes along November 2022 with ChatGPT. Huge excitement, this changes everything. Huge fears, everyone, but it's all emotions. Very little substance, very little values. And of course, education technology has been long driven along vibes, not values. Jane Kenway and Chris Bigham talked 30 years ago about EdTech boomsters and EdTech doomsters. Both these responses, I think, are very emotional and based on feelings around technology, mostly well-meaning, mostly understandable, but not based on any cogent set of values. Being an EdTech booster, I think, is perfectly understandable. The vibe here is completely positive and optimistic. We want to make a difference with technology. We want to use technology to fix things. We don't just want to critique things. But the tech doomster position is also completely understandable, but driven on vibes. There is a sinking feeling that the fundamental essence of education is changing. There's an inescapable sense that education is becoming more standardized, more robotic, hollowed out, and that the 40 years of the EdTech revolution has made things different, but it hasn't necessarily made things better. So I think support and opposition for technology and education has long been based on what we feel and what we believe and what our hunch is. Support and opposition for EdTech has long been based as a matter of faith rather than a matter of fact. And EdTech has oscillated between these two extremes for the last 40 years. But what we're seeing now is really, really interesting. I think we're seeing a third way, EdTech with feelings, a third strand of emotion-led responses to what tech could be in education. Warmer, fuzzier conversations about human identity, human agency, human relationships, creativity, authenticity. People not wanting to give up on the potential of technology in education, but realizing that the debates we have got to be pushed beyond simplistic kind of ambitions for what's right, what works, and the stuff we used to talk about for the past 30 years. And it's not just this conference. There's a broader push for EdTech for good, human-centered EdTech ethics. This is all perfectly understandable, but I think also highly problematic at the moment, because at the moment it's still based on vibes. It's still based on feelings. Without tangible action, these are just empty platitudes that make us feel better because we're talking about being human and caring and empathy. But without any guiding principles, guiding intentions, these words are not going to lead to any change whatsoever to this field. So I think we need to take the OEB conference theme this year really seriously. We do need to talk about having a more human, having a more caring, having a more compassionate EdTech, but we can't simply trust that it's just going to happen. Superficially engaging with these values is not going to lead to any real change. So I think there's a danger that when we talk about the things we're talking about at this conference, we overlook the fact that the technologies we develop and deploy are entwined with structural issues, systematic disadvantage, and we're ignoring the hard work that it's actually going to take to make things better. So there's a danger we slip into just another form of magical thinking about technology. So we need to talk about these things in terms of values rather than just feelings. And that, for me, is what this conference theme is all about. And of course, talking about values is really messy. It's a normative process. It's about trying to reach a consensus about things we don't really agree about. What actions are best to take? What's the best way to live? So for me, these conference themes are about things like ethical values of EdTech. What do we mean? Well, human autonomy, we talked about that. What do we consider to be a good life or a life worth living? What risks do we think are acceptable to impose on others? How do we want to interact with each other on a personal basis? And it's also about the social values of EdTech as well. How do we want to live together as societies? How do we want to encourage political discourse? How do we want to attend to social injustices? And what we do in EdTech relates to all of these bigger questions. And I think that's what this conference is trying to push us to be towards. But these OEB themes are really radical things to be taking on. These aren't just vague slogans that we're saying the right thing and it makes us sound better, this kind of virtue signaling. If we take this seriously, it actually means reimagining what EdTech is along completely different moral and political lines, and engaging with the moral and political perspectives of other people, not just people like us. This is a real radical shift for this field to be taking, and it's really exciting. If we take it seriously, it means a completely different form of EdTech. But the problem is, this field is not very good at dealing with values. A lot of people, I think, in EdTech just assume that technology is essentially a good thing. EdTech is a positive project. We want to make the world better. Technology makes things better. A lot of tech insiders see their work as neutral, as completely value-free, objective, rational, scientific. You know, this idea that technology is a neutral tool, it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. And also a lot of tech outsiders simply feel there's no way they can change the dominant form of technology that we have at the moment. There's a default sense of digital resignation. What else can we do? There is no alternative. So as a result, our field, EdTech, has not done values particularly well. But I believe we can get better at doing this. I really do believe that we can collectively engage with the values that we want to be driving our work. We can at least start having these discussions. I think this involves at least 4 things. We need to start seeing EdTech as a collective concern. We need to see EdTech from the point of view of others, especially others not like us. And this is a key point, I think. A lot of people in EdTech in this room are in a privileged position of being super served by tech. Technology is a fantastic thing for me. And the default position is to think, tech is great for me, how can I make it work in the same way for other people? The flip side is to say, technology is actually harmful for quite a lot of people. How can we work to stop this? And this quote from Abiba Birhan sums this up perfectly well. Let's start from the point of view that AI, in particular EdTech, is a tool that exacerbates inequality, injustice, and harms, and the most marginalized, unless people make sure it doesn't. And I think we need to flip the script and start from the bottom up. We also would need to acknowledge the values that are inherent in current forms of technology. Technology is not neutral-free. We know this. The technology we have at the moment, I think, is driven by commercial logics of maximizing profit and market reach, economicizing logics of cost-effectiveness, scalability, planned obsolescence, there's rationalist logics of efficiency and precision and effectiveness, and individualized logics as well of personalization, self-interest, self-responsibilization. We need to acknowledge those values in tech, and we also need to acknowledge the values that are inherent in the current education systems in which our tech works. At the moment, we have education systems that are not fair. At the moment, we get the ed tech that fits well with the values of education contexts that are standardized, that are metric-driven, that reproduce inequalities. We get ed tech that fits very well with education systems that are authoritarian and surveillant and manipulative. We need to develop ed tech that disrupts these patterns of injustice that already exist in education systems. And then number 4 is the really difficult thing, specifying what other values we want to base our work around in the future. And I think this is where we come to the OEB theme. There's a few things I picked up in the call for papers. You're talking, I think, about a respect for people, a new form of ed tech that's based around things like priorities of care and kindness and compassion and uncertainty and collective interest. I would also argue we need to think about ed tech that has a respect for the planet. The environmental issues and sustainability issues associated with the technologies that we work with, I think, are really worrying. So we might want to think about other forms of values around the ed tech we have in terms of, say, degrowth, for example, or computing within limits. There are lots of different ways we can choose to go with this, but we do need to start thinking about where we want to go. Personally, I'm really interested in this idea of a public interest ed tech. What would it mean to have ed tech that was based around ideas of public interest priorities, say of cooperative and collective governance, for example, or shared resources? There's a whole, that completely makes us rethink what we mean by education technology in really exciting ways that redistribute power, that challenge existing power dynamics and structural inequalities, and move us to a different form of doing education, of doing learning, of doing teaching. What would it mean to have education technology that's genuinely accessible to everybody, of benefit to everybody, including ideas of intergenerational benefit, for example, or environmental benefit? What would it mean to rethink education that has a democratic ideal of representing everybody? All members of society should have a say in what type of ed tech is being developed and how it's deployed. And how can we really think about ed tech that's beneficial to everyone? And that's values of solidarity, values of community, developing ed tech along cooperative lines that genuinely involve everybody. And there's lots of other ways we can think about this. There's some really exciting ways of thinking about technology in terms of civic tech, indigenous tech, feminist tech. There are all sorts of things. We just need to think about values in a different way. But we also need to be clear on what these values entail. These values entail doing a lot of hard work. And actually, these values entail getting rid of a lot of existing ed tech that might be antithetical to these values. So there are some really difficult conversations we need to have, particularly around the keywords at this conference. If we're talking about human-centered ed tech, which humans are we talking about? Are we just talking about humans in Europe, in the global north, in the global south? If we talk about agency, are we talking about agency in an individualistic way or in a collective sense? When we talk about care, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a feminist ethics of care? A lot of which I think is not necessarily embodied in the tech that we have at the moment. I hear a lot of people saying we need a European ed tech. What does a European ed tech mean? What are the values behind that? What does it mean to have a Danish ed tech or a German ed tech? These are things I think that really challenge us to think about the politics of what we're doing. So, I realize this is not the usual thing that we talk about at OEB. I'm so sorry to bum you out, but I don't think we can have a conference theme like this and just ignore it. Or just say, oh yes, care, humanity, and then go away and do the things that we normally do all the time. There's a lot of work to be getting on with. I think we need to look for examples of ed tech around the edges that are between the cracks of mainstream ed tech that embody some of these principles. And there are some really interesting forms of ed tech that do kind of fit what I was just described here. We need to take seriously the idea of democratizing and diversifying how we develop ed tech. I think we need to take seriously some of the recent attempts to build different forms of tech, and we need to really think about democratizing AI governance and ed tech governance in particular. And hopefully, this moves us on from what I've described as vibe-based approach to a more value-based approach. I think ed tech can make a change. Ed tech can make a difference. It's not going to be easy, but I think it is possible. The norms around dominant edtech at the moment is that there's no alternative. How can we possibly think beyond the forms of AI that we have? How can we possibly think beyond the big, Google, Alphabet, and all the rest of it? But I think there's enough brain power in this room to actually start supporting the development of new forms of edtech that can really help make the world that we want to be living in the future. So I do believe that better edtechs are possible, but it's going to be a lot of hard work. So let's get on with it.
Neil, thank you so much for drilling down into some of the complexities around the conference theme.